Hi, everyone. We're going to continue with Found. So, when we left off, we just finished chapter 25. Chapter 25 kind of ended with a bang, sorry. Um, they were sorted officially. So, there's two groups. Mr. Hodge, they're at the adoption conference, and Mr. Hodge's group has 36 people in it. And with the exception of the fact that Daniela McCarthy isn't there, although Catherine has pretended to be Daniela McCarthy, which is probably not great, there are 36 kids in that group. And she just had informed Jonah, they now have you. So we pick up there, chapter 26. Why? Jonah whispered, but Jonah knew the answer. He didn't have to think about it. The note. Beware, they're coming back to get you. The words from the letter echoed in his mind, leaving room for nothing but panic. Chip, he whispered in his friend's ear, if they say great news, we have an offer to give out free airplane rides this morning. Don't get on the plane. Do you hear me? Don't get on any freaking plane. Okay, Chip said, puzzled. He apparently hadn't figured anything out the way that Catherine and Jonah had. He hadn't been able to hear their conversation. Jonah didn't have time to even fill him in. He turned back to Catherine. Catherine, you have got to go tell them you're not Daniela. Maybe this will stop them. Maybe if they realize that Daniela's still here, like she's still in Michigan or wherever. If I do, they're going to put me in the other group, Catherine said. I'm not going to leave you and Chip. She crossed her arms stubbornly and jutted out her lower lip, like she did any time she fought with Jonah. But today, Jonah loved her for it. He loved her for it, even as he wondered, what if something happens to me and Catherine both that will kill Mom and Dad? Besides, you apparently need me around to figure things out, Catherine argued infuriatingly. Well, you're not the only one with a brain here, Jonah countered. Well, I'm the only one who has a brain that isn't being traumatized, Catherine said, looking at Chip, who now seemed to be putting everything together. His face had gone pale, and he was mouthing the word plane. Plane, do you really think? At the front of the group, several steps onto the staircase, Mr. Hodge clapped his hands together. All righty, group, let's get started. We're the lucky ones because we get to go outside first. Carol's group is going to be sitting in the classroom first. Does this mean we're going to get stuck in a classroom this afternoon? Someone asked. It was one of the kids with the skull sweatshirt. Jonah didn't catch Mr. Hodge's answer because he was thinking, oh, please, an ordinary classroom with some adult making a voice drone on. That's the greatest danger that maybe I'd fall asleep. Jonah knew he was in much greater danger than that right now. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his system, his whole body on alert. But he didn't know what he was supposed to do with the adrenaline. He didn't know where or what the danger was. He didn't really believe they were going to be herded onto an airplane. But do they need an airplane to herd us anywhere? Sometime else? What if it's like what happened to Angela, where we take one step forward and suddenly we're gone? Catherine jabbed an elbow into his ribs, and Jonah realized he had begun swinging his head from side to side, arms tense, fists ready, like somebody was trying to fight with him. Don't act weird, she whispered. People are starting to stare at you. Jonah dropped his fists and forced himself to concentrate on what Mr. Hodge was trying to say. Before I go on, I need to introduce Gary Payne. He's another caseworker who's going to be assisting me with your group. Gary, come on up here. A younger man dressed casually in a sweatshirt and jeans jogged up to the stairs to stand next to Mr. Hodge. He was barely taller than Mr. Hodge, but he was a lot bulkier. Jonah could see bulging muscles where Gary had pushed up his sweatshirt sleeves. Wait a minute. Is this muscles? Is this E? Jonah leaned over and whispered urgently to Catherine and Chip, but helplessly both of them shrugged. Who could tell? They never saw his face. On the hike, I'll lead the way, and Gary will bring up the rear to make sure that there are no stragglers, Mr. Hodge said, grinning to make it sound like it was a joke. Like who would want to lag behind on such a beautiful day on a lovely hike? Mr. Hodge began explaining the point of the hike, something about fitting yourself into nature, finding one's identity to connect through one's environment. For the first part of the hike, I'd like you to walk in complete silence. Really concentrate on what you're seeing around you, he said. We'll stop and chat about what we've discovered later in that silence. Wait a minute, we're not allowed to talk, Jonah thought, his panic spiking. We're not allowed to talk to each other? We're not allowed to help the other kids? Let's head for the middle of the pack, Catherine said, so Gary and Mr. Hodge can't see us talking. That's right. Break the rules. It was strange how much relief Jonah felt realizing breaking the rules was possible. Mr. Hodge jumped down from the stairs and began leading the group through a hallway and out the door in the back of the school. Jonah led about a dozen kids file out ahead of him. He could see them stretched out across the yard in the sunshine, heading for the woods of the nature preserve. It was a cheerful scene, but Jonah got chills watching. It reminded him of something from when he was a little kid. The Pied Piper, he thought. He and Catherine had had a book of fairy tales when they were little, and she had loved it, but he had hated it because of that one illustration that frightened him, the one of the Pied Piper leading the children of Hamelin to their doom. In the picture, the children were skipping and laughing and dancing to the piper's tune, but Jonah knew exactly what was going to happen to them. He couldn't stand for them to be so happy when they should have been really scared. Mr. Hodge isn't playing music, Jonah reminded him. He's not magical. He cannot force us to do a thing we don't want to do. And yet there was Jonah following him out the door, pushing his way. We have to warn the other kids, Jonah murmured to Chip and Catherine. Catherine looked startled, but Chip nodded and fell back to talk to the boy behind him. Hi, I'm Chip Winston, he heard Chip say softly. I called you a few weeks ago. Did you get any more strange letters? No, Jonah thought, that approach is going to take way too long. What if they only had a few minutes? Jonah sped up and fell into step with the girl ahead of them. He didn't even take the time to look at her name tag to see if she had been on the list he knew about. Don't trust Mr. Hodge or Gary, he muttered. Pass it on. She gave him a "are you crazy" look and pointedly did not pass it on to anyone else. Jonah sighed and stepped up to the next kid. You can't trust Mr. Hodge or Gary, he whispered. We're in danger. You need to be careful. Jonah was able to reach 3 more kids before he felt a strong hand on his shoulder, just as they were about to step into the woods. It was Gary, who had rushed up from the end of the line. Didn't you hear the instructions? He hissed into Jonah's ear. This is the silent part of the walk. If you can't follow the directions, you will need to stay in the back of the line with me. So they stood at the edge of the woods while all the other kids filed past. Catherine shot Jonah a white-faced, worried look when she walked by, but there was nothing she could do. Chip didn't even glance in Jonah's direction. Good, Jonah thought. Pretend you don't know me, and then they won't watch you, and you can give out warnings. He could feel the weight of Gary's hand still on his shoulder, heavier than it should be, holding him in place. Finally, the last kid walked past, and Gary let go. Okay, it's your turn now, Gary said quietly, but remember, no more talking. How could Jonah talk when Gary was right beside him walking and watching? Despairingly, Jonah trudged forward. He could see the other kids snaking along the trail ahead of him, going deeper and deeper into the woods. Jonah had managed to talk to only 5 of them. Even if Chip reached all the others, would they even believe him? What could they do anyway? After about a mile, Jonah realized that Mr. Hodge was gathering everyone together at the front of the line. Circle up, he called out. He was standing on a rock now, so they could all see him. Jonah joined the back of the crowd and tried to inconspicuously angle himself away from Gary, towards Catherine and Chip. Gary didn't try to hold Jonah back, but Jonah could feel his eyes were looking at him. So few people know this, Mr. Hodge was saying, but there's a rather extensive cave back here, right off the path. It's one of the best-kept secrets of Clarksville. It's usually off limits to the public, but we've received special permission to take you all in the cave. We'll talk about your identities in the cave. Did those words sound ominous to anybody other than them? Jonah looked around, but most of the kids just looked bored and distant, as if this was a really dull class at school. Mr. Hodge bent down, ready to scramble from the rock, but then he straightened up again. Oh, I almost forgot, he said. There's a really interesting rock formation right as you enter the cave. I forget the exact scientific explanation, but there's something really odd about the rock. So if you spread your hand out and touch it at the right spot, you can feel one patch of the stone that's 15 degrees colder than the rest of the rock. It's bizarre. I'll show you exactly where to touch when you go in. Then he hopped down from the rock and led them downhill, down a winding offshoot trail towards the crevice behind the rock. Touch right here, he instructed the first boy behind him, the gangly kid who kept tripping over his own feet. Spread your fingers out. Do you feel it? Mr. Hodge said. Yeah, the boy said, sounding surprised. Okay, now you can go in through there and you can sit on one of the benches at the back of the cave, Mr. Hodge said. Next. Jonah watched a girl repeat the same process, and after barely a second, she jerked her hand back. Ow! Oh, you couldn't have felt it that quickly, Mr. Hodge said. It doesn't hurt. Here, I'll show you how to do it. He took her hand and pressed it against the rock one more. See, Mr. Hodge said. Sure, the girl said. but Jonah had the impression that she was trying to get away. She followed the gangly boy into the cave. Jonah watched the next few kids, watched the way that Mr. Hodge seemed so determined that each kid touched that rock and that each hand lingered on the rock for a couple of seconds. It reminded him of something from a movie he couldn't remember, a movie he saw at school. Yeah, oh yeah, it was about an epidemic, right? The scientists went into the laboratories, and when they went in, they got scanned. They used a scanner to scan their hand. I mean, there couldn't be dangerous viruses in the cave, right? Jonas suddenly saw his mistake. Catherine, he said. He spoke softly through gritted teeth because Mr. Hodge was looking at him. Catherine turned her head. Maybe it was just looking, but Jonah pretended to trip, stumbling into Catherine, and then whispered in her ear, "That's a hand scanner. Be careful." And that's where we're going to stop.